Welcome to the deep dive. We're really thrilled you're joining us today because we have a fascinating and honestly a slightly unsettling journey ahead of us.
Yeah, it really is a bit of a paradigm shifter.
It is. So to kick things off, I want to share a famous thought from Thomas Jefferson. Back in 1816, he wrote, quote, "Where the press is free and every man able to read, all is safe."
Right, which is a very comforting foundational idea about democracy.
Exactly. But we're going to explore a very specific paradox today. What if the press is completely free and the people can read perfectly well, but local politics is just completely ignored? What happens to that safety when the press just isn't paying attention to the local power structures?
And that is exactly the democratic friction we're examining today, because in mature democracies, especially in the U.S., there is this glaring absence of active news coverage at the local congressional level.
And it's not just because, local zoning board meetings or obscure committee hearings are boring.
No, not at all. There is a deeply structural, hidden economic force at play here. It dictates what makes it onto the front page and what gets completely ignored.
And to figure out what that force is, we are pulling our insights from a brilliant National Bureau of Economic Research working paper by James M. Snyder, Jr. and Davis Stromberg.
It's an incredible piece of research.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to uncover how the sheer economic geography of media markets secretly shapes the actual substance of our democracy. We're going to explore how this geography dictates politician behavior, changes voter intellect, and even redirects massive flows of federal funding.
The researchers looked at a massive data set from the early 1980s through the early 2000s, tracking U.S. House representatives, voter habits, and exactly where federal dollars went. And they found this invisible engine driving the entire system of accountability.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the core problem, the authors point out a severe mismatch or a really poor fit between the economic borders of media markets and the political borders of congressional districts. Why do those two maps look so different?
Well, think of it like a broken gear system. You have one gear labeled media markets and another labeled political jurisdictions.
And they just don't interlock properly.
Right, they don't mesh. When they fail to bite into each other, you get these red sparks of lost information. Newspapers distribute based on economic logic, urban centers, commuter routes, advertising demographics.
But political districts are drawn up based on population counts. Or, frankly, partisan gerrymandering.
Exactly. So as media consolidates and goes digital, a single newspaper in a major city might suddenly find itself with readers spread across 10 different congressional districts. It's too many political units to cover, so the reporting inevitably becomes superficial.
Which brings us to the core framework of the paper. The researchers lay out a complete 5-step causal chain of political accountability.
Yeah, it's like a row of dominoes. Step 1 is geographic congruence, basically the fit between the markets and the districts.
Step 2 is media coverage. Step 3 is voter information.
And then step 4 is politician action, which finally leads to step 5, policy output.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at step 1. Congruence is simply defined as how well a newspaper's readership overlaps with a single congressional district. It's a reader share weighted average.
And to give you a concrete visual example, the paper looks at the map of Missouri. It's a perfect, natural, quasi-experiment.
Right in the northwest corner of Missouri, you have the St. Joseph News Press. And because of how the map is drawn, that paper covers almost exactly one district.
Almost perfectly. That is high congruence. The economic border and the political border are basically the same thing.
But if you look near Kansas City...
Yeah, it falls apart.
Completely. The market crosses state lines, readers are scattered, and congruence just plummets.
So that's step 1. Now moving to step 2, driving the ink. The data proves that this congruence directly drives news coverage. They looked at over 4,000 observations from 161 newspapers between 1991 and 2002.
And what did they find?
A massive elasticity, an elasticity of 0.50 to be precise. For a typical newspaper, moving to perfect congruence means the local representative gets roughly 50 more articles written about them every single year.
50 extra articles a year, just because the map lines match up. That is a huge amount of sustained exposure.
It's massive.
Which brings us to step 3. If the ink is hitting the page, what happens to the voters? Does 50 extra articles actually make people smarter?
It absolutely does. The researchers used the American National Election Studies, the ANES, to track voter knowledge. And in those perfectly congruent districts, a voter's ability to correctly recall their representative's name jumps by 28%.
28%? But how big of a cognitive leap is that, really?
It's equivalent to the knowledge gap between someone with just a grade school education and a college graduate.
Wow.
Yeah, the local media effect is essentially equal to a massive boost in formal education, and voters in these areas are also 20 to 30% more willing to rate their politician ideologically and much better at pointing out specific pros and cons about them.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. A skeptic could say, well, maybe areas where a single paper dominates just happen to have wealthier, more highly educated people who naturally buy more papers anyway.
What's fascinating here is how the researchers solved that exact endogeneity problem, because any economist would ask that. To prove pure causation, they used redistricting.
Right, the 1990 and 2000 census district redraws.
Exactly. So the physical geography doesn't change, the people don't move, and the newspaper delivery routes stay identical. The only thing that shifts is the invisible political boundary.
So you take the exact same voters and suddenly throw them into a new district with a completely different level of media congruence.
And their political knowledge shifts in lockstep with that new media reality. Even controlling for all county-level fixed effects, the data proves it's the geography of the media causing the knowledge, not the underlying demographics of the people.
That's a brilliant way to isolate the variable. But let me ask you about television. Because local TV news is huge. Surely they're keeping voters informed, too.
Actually, no. The TV plot twist is pretty shocking. They ran the exact same models for TV markets DMAs and found that television congruence has zero significant effect on name recall or substantive political knowledge.
Zero effect.
Zero. Even though TV congruence increases the likelihood that someone watches the local news, local TV stations rarely dedicate any actual news time to local House representatives.
So newspapers really are the undeniable anchor of local political accountability.
They are the absolute bedrock. Without them, the knowledge just isn't there.
Which naturally pivots us to step 4, the politicians themselves. If the voters are significantly more informed because they're reading the paper, the politicians must know they're operating under a microscope.
Oh, they definitely know. When the newspaper is constantly watching, they shift their behavior drastically. They work much harder for the district to get that free, positive PR.
Right, and the paper highlights a great example of this with Representative Jack Brooks from Texas. He represented the 9th District, which was incredibly congruent.
Yeah, the newspaper basically covered only him.
So in 1994, to fight for federal public works funds for his district, Brooks testified as a witness at congressional hearings 14 times in a single year.
14 times is an unbelievable amount of effort for a representative to put into witness testimonies.
And the data shows he wasn't an outlier. Moving from zero to perfect congruence increases a representative's witness appearances, especially on appropriations or Ways and Means committees, by an average of 46%.
That's about an extra 1.5 appearances per Congress. They become bulldogs for their local area. And it also changes where they choose to spend their time behind closed doors.
How so?
Well, highly monitored politicians actively flee from broad macro policy committees, things like foreign affairs or the judiciary.
Because the local paper back home doesn't really care about foreign affairs.
Exactly. They shift to constituency-oriented port committees, agriculture, natural resources, veterans affairs, places where they can deliver tangible local wins that get giant headlines.
They're trading national statesmanship for local pork. But what about when it comes time to actually vote on the floor? When they're forced to choose between strict party loyalty and the interests of their district?
The local district wins. Political scientists use nominate scores to measure ideological voting patterns, and the researchers found that in perfectly congruent areas, the ideological gap between Democrats and Republicans shrinks by a massive 25%.
So they drop from a score gap of like 0.69 down to 0.50.
Precisely. They become significantly more moderate. They cross party lines because they know if they sell out local interests to please party bosses in Washington, the local press will ruthlessly expose them and the voters will punish them.
The local newspaper essentially acts as a leash, pulling them away from the extremes.
It forces them to walk the tightrope of the district's actual needs.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this brings us to step 5, the ultimate payoff. All of this media coverage, all this voter knowledge, the politicians sweating under the spotlight, what does it actually produce?
It produces cold, hard cash. The researchers analyzed the massive flow of federal spending across every U.S. county. We're talking about money that makes up about 10% of the entire U.S. GDP.
And when you map that money, where does it go?
Controlling for all other demographics and economic variables, areas where congruence goes from 0 to 1 see a 10% increase in federal spending per capita.
A 10% increase on a baseline of roughly $2,700 per person. That's almost $300 extra per capita. Multiply that across an entire district, and you are talking about an astronomical amount of public wealth.
Millions upon millions of dollars, flowing to an area simply because the local newspaper's borders match the political borders.
That is wild. But what about the actual elections? I mean, with all this money and all this knowledge, you'd assume voter turnout in these areas goes through the roof.
You'd think so, but the data on the electoral ripples is actually really surprising. The effect on turnout is tiny. Yeah. The model suggests that if local news completely stopped covering the House tomorrow, voter turnout in big election years would drop by less than 1%, like 0.8%.
That's barely a blip. What about the incumbency advantage? Do these highly covered politicians just lock down their seats forever?
Also, no, the incumbency advantage only moves by about 1 percentage point. Because while the media exposes the incumbent's victories, it also exposes the challenger's name to the public.
So the key takeaway here is that local media doesn't radically change if you vote.
Right. It radically changes who you hold accountable, how they behave, and what policy you get in return. It's about the substance of democracy, not just the procedural act of showing up to the polls.
So what does this all mean for us today? Because this study looked at the peak newspaper era. If we look around now, we are living in the age of the news gizzard.
It's a really alarming shift. Decades ago, every town had a local paper dedicated to this stuff. But today, with traditional print media collapsing, that geographic congruence is just disintegrating.
We see this with the internet. There's this myth that the internet democratized information, but really all our attention and subscription dollars are funneling straight up to giant national networks. CNN, the New York Times.
Exactly. And the vast local grid underneath them is turning into a dark, gray information desert. As the local reader share vanishes, the economic incentive to stick a reporter in a boring local congressional hearing evaporates.
And if we follow the exact five-step causal chain we just talked about, that means voter information inevitably crashes.
Politicians stop fighting for local federal dollars. And worse, that moderate leash is severed. They're free to retreat into extreme partisan voting blocks because the local press isn't there to punish them for it.
Right, which means we really have to revise Thomas Jefferson's quote. Free press and literacy just aren't enough.
They really aren't. The press must have an explicit economic motive, high geographic congruence to cover local politics. Without that financial incentive, the accountability just vanishes. Freedom of the press doesn't guarantee political safety if the market gears don't interlock with the political map.
Which leaves you with a final provocative thought to mull over today. We know how vital this localized geographic congruence was to forcing leaders to actually fight for our communities.
Yeah.
But as our digital media landscape becomes completely detached from our physical zip codes,
As we spend all our time arguing about national issues on our phones.
exactly, what new systems can we possibly build to force our local leaders to keep caring about our specific backyards? Or is the very engine of local democracy quietly breaking down while we're all just distracted by the national news feed?
That is the defining democratic challenge of our time.
Something to think critically about the next time you realize you haven't heard a single thing about your own local representative in months. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.